Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism webinar. My name is Julie Ansis. I'm the founding director of Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism. We were founded in the summer of 2021, and this is our wonderful speaker series. The mission of Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism is to, one, address and combat anti-Semitism within the field of psychology and related fields. Two, foster training and education that increases sensitivity and responsiveness to anti-Semitism and its effects on individuals, families, and communities. And three, foster Jewish-affirming research, education, clinical practice, and organizations. We are composed of approximately 400 psychologists and other mental health professionals, including faculty, clinicians, and administrators. If you wish to learn more and join us, I put the website address in the chat. All you have to do is complete the form in the link at the bottom of the homepage, and you will be added to our email list. We also have a Twitter, or what's known as X account now. I'll also put that in the chat. We're at PsychAAS. We have a Facebook page and a YouTube channel. All of this information is on the website. Now for today's event, I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kent Harber. Dr. Harber will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and we will then open the floor to Q&A. Mics are currently muted to avoid disruptions. If you wish to speak, just click on the reactions tab on your screen and tap raise hands, and I will unmute you. Or I think you're able to unmute yourself though. Just a brief bio on Dr. Harber. Dr. Harber is a professor of psychology at Rutgers University in Newark. His research program focuses on interracial feedback, how psychosocial resources affect perceptions of the physical world and the social world, emotional disclosure and social judgment, and modern-day anti-Semitism. Professor Harber received his doctorate in experimental social psychology from Stanford University. He completed postdoctoral training in health behavior at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and then worked for 2 years as a research scientist at American Institute for Research in Palo Alto, California, where he focused on class size reduction and effective teaching practices. In 1999, he had accepted his current position at Rutgers in Newark. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the Lucent Foundation. It has been featured in The Atlantic, Newsweek, Huffington Post, and other popular venues. The title of Dr. Kent Harber's talk today is Anti-Semitism and Attitudes Toward Israel. So this is somebody who's done actual empirical research on the topic, and I'm very excited to have him here to speak with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Kent.
Julie, thank you very much. That's a very gracious introduction. I really appreciate you inviting me to speak for this group. So first, is my PowerPoint visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, great. And then, Julie, if you wouldn't mind, if there are any just clarification questions that come up at some point where something that I said just wasn't, the conceptually wasn't clear or something, I'm glad to address those during our presentation. And then when done, we'll open it up. And, also, Julie, if you feel like, I'm crossing a time limit, just let me know and I'll speed it up. So
yeah, no worries. I mean, 30, 40 minutes, however long you want to do and however long you want to have for Q&A is totally fine.
Okay. All right, great. All right, well, I'll get going then. So this talk is Anti-Semitism, Attitudes Towards Israel. And let me start with an event that I experienced a few years ago. Rutgers has this International Day where they sort of, Rutgers prides itself as being one of the most, if not the most culturally diverse campus in the United States. And we celebrate this by having an event where different parts of the globe are represented in these different booths and tents. And so I was wandering around and went to the Middle East tent, And I could see flags lined up for all the Middle East countries, but I didn't see Israel. And I asked, where's the Israeli flag? And they got this sort of dismissive shrug. And then I saw there was a gap between some of the flags I wanted there. And then you can see what I found there, the Israeli flag ripped from its grommet sitting by a trash can. And my visceral experience was, as a Zionist and as a Jew, I felt outraged and disturbed and threatened. And then I asked myself, well, maybe I was being outraged and disturbed and threatened as a Zionist, but not necessarily as a Jew. Maybe this was a Zionist insult, not a Jewish insult. Maybe being anti-Israel and being anti-Jewish are separable things. Well, there clearly is evidence that the attacks on Jews for being pro-Israel are increasing. And I got a sense that this audience, you know of many of these events. But just some of these so more eye-catching ones, Zionist sexual assault victims who helped establish a survivor group for sexual assault people were kicked out for being Zionist. At USC, student government vice president was driven out of office for being pro-Israel. Tufts attempts to oust a judiciary committee member simply because he supported Israel. So these people had done nothing in violation of their duties. The only thing they had done wrong was that they liked Israel. And of course, we know that there are increasing and disturbing attacks on Jews for being Jews. You know, the most extreme ones being actual physical attacks in Jersey City, Pittsburgh, Colleyville. So the question here is, are these two increasing trends, anti-Zionist attacks on college campuses and elsewhere, increased anti-Semitism in the United States, are these connected or are they coincidental? Well, there's a very good Wall Street Journal article from last December that explores these issues. And they interview, amongst other people, Dylan Saba, who's a lawyer supporting Palestine Legal. And Saba states, I'm just going to read what he says here, anti-Zionism is a political position distinct from anti-Semitism, which is a prejudice. The two are conflated by supporters of Israel to discredit critics, he says. So there is no real connection. There is a false connection, he asserts, that is only done in the service of pro-Zionists. Condemning Israel may make some Jewish students feel uncomfortable. That does not make it anti-Semitic. So this is now a key core issue. Is there any kind of relation? Is there any meaningful relation between being anti-Zionist and being anti-Jewish? Or is this camouflage and smoke just in the behest of Israel? So the research I'm going to describe addresses this and related issues. The first is, are anti-Israel attitudes and anti-Semitism at all related? If Saab is correct, the relation will be minimal if it exists at all. Do social connections that spark anti-Semitism also increase hostility to Israel? So one way of knowing if there is a connection between the two is to see if the cause of one is the cause of the other. If they have a joint cause, that strengthens the implication that they are actually related phenomena. And then to drill down a bit further, not only might there be a common cause, but can we locate the nature of that common cause? And I'm going to talk about this theory called terror management. It's kind of a lurid term. It's an interesting theory that might explain what are the root causes of both anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sympathies or sentiments. And then finally, as Julie mentioned, one of the research interests I have is how psychological states of threat can affect the way the physical world is actually seen. So for example, when people are frightened, they see tarantulas or spiders as closer than they actually are. They see heights as greater than they actually are than when they're not frightened. So scary things get exaggerated. If Israel is a scary thing, is it also exaggerated? Okay, so that's what I'm going to be covering in the talk today. Just kind of quick comment on the measures I use. One is this measure of anti-Semitism by Selznick and Steinberg. It's dated, but it asks, it's a fairly straightforward sort of just has sort of kind of street level validity, that the questions are unambiguous. Most of them are negatively valent. So Jews are more willing than others to use shady practices. Others are positively valent. Jews are much more like other Americans. And so the total score is all the ones in red. The ones in blue are reverse coded, and you get a summary score of anti-Semitism from this measure. So it's a standard measure. There are, at this point, no validated measures of Israel attitudes. So my team and I have been working on developing one we're calling the Middle East Opinion Survey. And it's a combination of pro-Israel items, like number one here, Israel is the main reason, anti-Israel items, like the first one here in red, Israel is the main reason for troubles in the Middle East. Pro-Israel items, Israel generally respects minority rights. Those two subscales are both reliable. They are moderately related. So the more that you are pro-Israel, the less you are anti-Israel. This is important that they are moderately related because it indicates that there's some ambivalence. People can both have positive feelings towards Israel and some critical feelings towards Israel. I got to be clear that though the scales have themselves strong internal reliability, the overall measure, this, I don't want to get too technical, there's analysis called confirmatory factor analysis. It's sort of the gold standard that you have a valid scale, and we're working on achieving that. We don't have that yet. So sort of a caveat on the Middle East Opinion Survey. But that's what I've been using in the research I'm going to describe. Okay, and this is, I know you're all psychologists. I know you've all seen this cautionary about correlation and causation, but just to do it one more time, anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment could be related because anti-Semitism causes anti-Israel sentiment, or it could be because anti-Israel sentiment causes anti-Semitism, or they both mutually cause each other, or they're not at all directly related causally. They're related by some underlying phenomena like sociopathy. And so a lot of what I'm going to be reporting here are correlations. So I just need to give that standard causation, caution. Okay. All right, so now let's get into some data. I've recently done a whole series of studies looking that, amongst other things, measure anti-Israel sentiment and standard anti-Semitism. These are all studies that have been supported by the Academic Engagement Network, which I'm sure many of you know of. And so, without going into the particulars of each of these studies, what they all have in common, what they all shared, is that I got those two measures: attitudes towards Israel and anti-Semitism. And I correlated in each of these 5 studies. And what I get are very strong correlations. And these are all, by the way, with online samples, not college students. So these are from the general public. And so you see the correlations run from 0.68, 0.7, 0.36, 0.65, 0.35. The average correlation between not liking Jews and not liking Israel is 0.55. In the likelihood that the two are connected is very strong. Now, in a way, this is not unlike a person could be strongly opposed to affirmative action and not be anti-feminist, not be anti-minority. But because the affirmative action provides, in a sense, a certain kind of cover for an underlying hostility, and it succeeds because there really can be a principled opposition to affirmative action. There can be principled opposition to Israel. But that can allow a camouflage for people whose actual motives are hostile rather than principled. We also found some correlations between being pro-Israel and being anti-Semitic. They're weaker, on average 0.18. I won't go into why I think that those exist. Towards the very, very end of today's talk. And the bottom line, I think the thing I want to focus on particularly is this strong correlation between being anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. Okay. So there is a connection. And I think whatever Mr. Sabud wants to believe, this is not just conflation of the Zionists trying to undermine a legitimate hostility towards Israel. It's a real connection. So the next issue then is what could be an underlying cause? Where would be the common links between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment? One of the things that we know historically is that anti-Semitism flourishes during times of social upheaval. So during the Black Plague, anti-Semitism had one of its spikes. In the decades preceding the Russian Revolution, there was massive anti-Semitism. And my mother's family came here because of what was occurring in Tsarist Russia at the turn of the century. In Germany during the interwar years following what Germany experienced in World War I and their depression. Again, probably one of the most horrid experiences of anti-Semitism. So there's a reason that there can be mass dislike, mass hostility towards certain groups during times of upheaval. And that's because there's a psychological need that those kinds of hostilities satisfy. So during collective threats, people want to regain a feeling of control. Conspiracy beliefs, having a visible enemy, feeling like you're part of an in-group with in-group knowledge, all those things confer some feeling of psychological control. And they therefore become more attractive. Demagogues know how to capitalize. They simplify and they target. So anti-Semitism has been, this is not my theory, as many people who are scholars on anti-Semitism believe anti-Semitism satisfies that need for simple answers with a visible target. My graduate student colleague, Valeria Villa and I did some research recently looking at just this general tendency of people to look for simplifying and vilifying answers during a time of social upheaval, in this case, the COVID crisis. And there was this infodemic of bogus beliefs that occurred around COVID. So there were socio-political ones, that COVID is a hoax designed to control the stock market. There are medical ones that you can cure COVID by putting a hair blower in your mouth. It doesn't work, by the way. There are spiritual ones that COVID pretends to end of days. People who believed in any one of these types also believed in the other types. And we found that the relation between having these kinds of unfounded, kind of goofy beliefs and feeling personal distress in your own life was extremely high, a correlation of 0.70. It's so high that you could look at these bogus beliefs as an indicator of psychological distress. Turns out that there is an interesting relation between these overall bogus, crazy beliefs in COVID and crazy and unfortunate beliefs about Jews in particular. And so we looked at, do Jews in Israel figure largely in these COVID bogus beliefs? Are COVID conspiracy beliefs about Jews related to COVID conspiracy beliefs about Israel? That's important, because if there's no connection between being anti-Israel and being anti-Semitic, there should be no connection between COVID conspiracy beliefs about Jews and about Israel? And does anti-Semitism affect political beliefs about Israel? In particular, support for the Abraham Accords. So what I got here is this big messy table of correlations. I'm going to try to break it down in ways that make it a little bit more accessible. So let's first look at this blue column of COVID conspiracy beliefs. These are, beliefs that there's a shady group that's controlling the stock market, that's benefiting, or that COVID is part of a plot to affect the government. None of these have directly involved Jews. The more someone is anti-Semitic, or people who are more anti-Semitic, were more likely to believe these general COVID conspiracy beliefs, and they were more resistant to actual facts about COVID. Like COVID could be cured by the new vaccines, or that wearing a mask could have some protective value. So in other words, the more people needed to have these goofy beliefs, the more resistant they were to actual facts, the more they were anti-Semitic. If you go now to the next column, this has to do with particular ways in which Jews are involved with COVID and Israel is involved in COVID. The more anti-Semitic a person was, the more likely they believed that COVID was a Jewish plot to exploit others. Okay, that would be an expression of anti-Semitism. That's not a shocker. But if you look at the next one, the more anti-Semitic a person is, the more likely they believe that COVID was an Israeli invention. Well, if there's no connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hostility, this correlation would be the same as saying being anti-Mormon correlates with believing that Ireland is responsible for COVID. It's incoherent, or it would be. And if you look at the next row here, being anti-Israel also relates to the belief that Jews exploit COVID. Again, if there's no connection between anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism, there should be no correlation between disliking Israel and having this crazy belief about Jews. But the relation does exist. These are all very strong correlations. Then if we go to the final columns here, the ones in green, these have to do about the Abraham Accords, the accords between Israel and Morocco and the Gulf states, which is generally seen as a great diplomatic success and something that sort of furthers peace in the world generally. It's a good thing. People who are anti-Semitic disfavor the peace accords between Israel and the Arab world, and they actively oppose them. So once again, we have this question: if they're unrelated, if anti-Semitism is unrelated to feelings about Israel, why would someone who dislikes Jews not want there to be peace between Israel and the Arab world? Okay. So I'm now going to go to sort of a next level of exploring how underlying sort of hostile sentiment is informing feelings about Israel. One way of sort of understanding, I think the way that Saba would explain hostility towards Israel, is that Israel does very particular actions which violate general principles, and therefore there's a rational hostility towards Israel based on very particular actions that violate, sort of general scruples. There's another way of understanding Israel, is that if you think that Israel is a fundamentally bad, scary place, you're going to see it in a distorted way. You literally will see it differently. So there's this very interesting research that I've drawn upon called Q distortion. And the basic way it operates is that, for example, someone who is spider phobic would see a spider that might be, well, this is already pretty big, but see the smaller one, they will visually experience it as bigger than it is. Things that are threatening are visually distorted. Well, Israel is a tiny country, but if Israel is seen as a personal threat, Israel too might be visually distorted, might be seen as bigger than it truly is. So we explored that in a study. We asked people in square miles, basically, how big. We gave them a series of countries from different parts of the world that they should all be relatively familiar with: Brazil, Egypt, France, Germany, Israel, Japan. We also asked them, what is the population size of those same countries? So how big is it geographically? How big is it demographically? And here's what we find. Blue is Israel, red are all the other countries. All the other countries do not differ from each other. We could just sum them together as one other country group. And this is the percent they were exaggerated. For all other countries, there's almost no exaggeration. Israel is exaggerated 5 times greater in terms of its geographic size than the other countries, and about 6.5 times, well, it's roughly the same proportion in terms of its population size, suggesting that there's something about Israel that represents an underlying threat. Now, one alternative explanation for why this exaggeration occurs is that it draws on cognitive dissonance. If I vilify something, somebody, I want to be able to justify the degree of animus that I direct towards it. Well, if Israel is the greatest threat to world peace, which would be suggested by the number of times it's condemned by the United Nations, Israel must be a really formidable threat. Well, exaggerating its size helps justify it. Recognizing that Israel is about the size of New Jersey and that you can fit all of Israel geographically into Lake Michigan makes it harder to claim as the greatest threat to world peace. So making it bigger helps make that argument. Here's another, so what I'm trying to get here is, what are the psychological functions that vilification of Israel serves? And there are all these, what I call these sort of these inverted headlines, where it's basically Israel has now killed, Israel has attacked Jordan, Israel attacks the West Bank, and then in parentheses, after bus bombing. Israel attacks Gaza, and then in parentheses, after 7 salvos of missiles hit the towns inside of Negev, where the response eclipses the cause. So I'm wondering, what's underlying this need to, in a sense, vilify Israel? Does it serve some psychological purpose? And here I'm going to get into a theory called terror management. It's a complicated theory, and I'm going to try to do it justice in relatively sort of brief sketch. So it's developed by a team of researchers, and it's based on this work of the philosopher Ernst Becker. And Becker identifies what he says as sort of the human existential dilemma. We are like all other creatures. We are psychologically wired to flee mortal danger. All animals, when they come across a predator, run away. We're wired to do that. But unlike other creatures, we know that there is a hazard we cannot run away from, which is our own mortality. Other animals are not aware that they're mortal. We are. We know that very early on. And that creates what they call an existential terror. We know we have a threat we can't escape. And that dilemma is solved by, according to the terror management theorist, culture. So what cultures do is they provide the psychological protection. They provide a worldview that helps annul and mitigate the threat of our own mortality. They do that through offering death transcendence. Religions offer an afterlife in many cases. And so, yes, this life is one of trial and woe, but if you're a good person, you will then go to the next life and things will be better. Or you'll come back as a higher caste. Or if they don't offer an afterlife, they can offer that by contributing to your society, you will have symbolic transcendence, symbolic immortality, because your contributions now will advance future generations, and you will exist that way. Cultures matter more, they claim, when people are more conscious of their own mortality. So there's that cliche, there are no atheists in foxholes. When people are faced with their own dire situations, they're more likely to want to find something that guarantees or assures their mortality, their immortality. There's an important caveat to that. If your culture is providing this vital psychological protection, then people who oppose your culture, who do not subscribe to the formulas your culture offers you, are undermining the protection that culture provides. They therefore represent a threat to your own way of coping with this fundamental existential threat of your own mortality. And so the terror management researchers have shown that that occurs in many cases, but also particularly about how non-Jews regard Jews. And so they've done these studies when they've had, for example, Christians who think about their own mortality score higher on measures of anti-Semitism than when they're not thinking of the mortality. Or college students who think about their own mortality are more likely to agree with the statement, the Holocaust is God's punishment to Jews, as opposed to when they're not thinking about the mortality. So the question that we're asking was, would mortality fears lead to selectively greater hostility to Israel compared to other countries? So this is how the study went. It was done, and this is with a team of other researchers at Rutgers. We got patients that a primary physician, one of the members of the team, her mother, this person's mother had these clinics, and it was just fortunate because we're able to sample not just college students, but a more general population. Average age 45, 70% female, most of them are white, most of them are Christian. We told our subjects, this study concerns personality and opinions on social issues. And they completed the study while they're waiting to just have their regular exam. This is it's a general internist. The first task the subjects did was this mortality salience task. This is one that's been used repeatedly in the many, many mortality salience studies. So those in the mortality salience condition, they were told, we want you to imagine what your own death will be like. Think about those moments and describe the emotions and thoughts you're going to have of dying. So they write a brief essay about their last, moments before they perish. Others were called the more pain salience condition. So we want to have a condition where you were also thinking of something really negative, unpleasant, but it wasn't death, so that we could isolate the role of mortality rather than just something bad in general. So imagine being in extreme pain. Describe the emotions and thoughts when in intense pain. Pain salience was a comparison condition to the mortality salience. The next thing they did is that they read a human rights essay from Amnesty International about a country that's mistreating its Muslim minority. In some cases, it's Israel mistreating Palestinians. For other subjects, it's India mistreating Kashmiris. For other subjects, Russia mistreating Chechens. And then after that, they endorsed penalties to the target country, Israel, India, or Russia. So I've said a lot. To sort of sum it up, there were 6 experimental conditions. You think about mortality, and then you read about Israel, or you think about India or about Russia, or you think about pain, and then you read about India or India or Russia, and then you endorse penalties. So this is what the amnesty report looked like. The spiraling violence and killings in, again, for some subjects, it was Israel. For some, it was India. For some, it was Russia. 3 separate groups. They only did one of those 3, didn't do all 3. So the spiraling violence and killings in Israel and Palestinian territories the past 4.5 years has brought untold suffering to the Palestinian and Israeli civilian populations. More than 3,200 Palestinians, including more than 600 children, more than 150 women have been killed by Israeli forces. Most of the victims were unarmed civilians who were not taking part in any armed confrontations. Thousands more have been injured, many of them maimed for life. Amnesty International has repeatedly condemned and campaigned against the killing of civilians. So this sounds pretty awful. Again, the target country was Israel, India, or Russia. After you read this Amnesty International statement, you are then allowed to endorse these 5 different penalties against the target country. Should there be a national protest campaign against country X, Israel, India, Russia, a citizen's boycott against the country, a withdrawal of aid to the country, US government economic sanctions, installation of a new government. You rated each of these 1 to 5. We then summed and averaged to get an overall penalty rating. So the higher the score, the more penalty you thought should be imposed on that offending country. And here's what we get. Israel's blue, all the other countries, pain salience is blue, death salience is red. And what we find is that subjects who are in the pain salience condition, they thought about some horrible pain and they wrote about it. If anything, they were a little less punitive to Israel than to India or Russia. Not significantly, but a little less. But if they thought about their own mortality, then there's an increase. And the increase is only significant and strongly significant for Israel. Thinking about your mortality for a non-Jew makes Israel, not India, not Russia, more deserving of severe penalties. What's the point? That if there is this underlying need to punish something that represents a psychological threat, well, India is Hindi primarily. Russia is either Christian or atheist. Israel's Jewish. And it's the one country that in which, when you think about your mortality, you become more punitive. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with just a final kind of complexity here. So this wasn't complex enough already. When we look at attitudes towards Israel by political affiliation, the story is a little complicated. I wish it were simpler as a researcher, but the world doesn't always cooperate. Democrats tend to be the least anti-Semitic compared to Republicans and independents. Republicans are the least anti-Israel compared to Democrats and independents, and they're the most pro-Israel. It seems to suggest that Democrats like Jews, but not Israel. Republicans like Israel, but not Jews. What this means, I'd be interested in your views. I think that in terms of the overall story that I've been communicating, it adds a level of complexity that needs to be accommodated. Okay, so I'm going to summarize here, and then we'll conclude. So first, is anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, are they unrelated as some would hold? They're not unrelated. They're very strongly related. They're so related that it's fair to say that you need to ask someone who is anti-Israel how they are not anti-Semitic, since it's most often the case that the two are connected. There are these troubling associations. People who are hostile to Jews believe that Israel created COVID. People who are hostile to Israel say the Jews exploit COVID. And that the more that Jews exploit COVID, I should have shown this correlation, the bigger Israel gets and the more populous it gets. These should not be related. If anti-Semitism and feelings about Israel are totally unrelated, a cockamamie belief that Jews exploit COVID should have no relation to the size of Israel. But they are related. Anti-Zionism as a cover for anti-Semitism might mitigate mortality fears. When non-Jews are facing their own fears about mortality, and they're searching for a target on which to focus their fear, Israel appears to satisfy that need. The dynamics of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism might vary by political identity. That's those measures I just showed you about the difference between Republicans and Democrats. We do need more causal experimental studies. Much of what I showed you was correlational. We need to show which is causing which, or if they both cause each other. And we need to update our measures of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The world is not what it was in 1968. And being able to reliably measure feelings towards Jews and towards Israel need to become more advanced. And that's my presentation. I want to thank you, my collaborators in this research, Miranda Levy and Valeria Villa, and the Academic Engagement Network, who supported a lot of this research. And now I'd like to hear questions.
Does anyone have any questions? I don't necessarily see all the hands up. Why don't you just unmute yourself? I know Ted had several questions, and then Mark, I see Mark.
Yeah,
Ted, go ahead.
so this is excellent, Ken. It brought to mind two immediate things, and I think you partially dealt with one of them, which is the connection between the theory that you posed and the cognitive dissonance issues that come up when you then present people with real facts and information that contrasts to what their beliefs are. So I think that's, clearly been an issue all along. But the one that I'm most interested in is kind of a time scale and an age level of respondents. So if you did some of these early studies, I believe, pre-2010 or 2011, there was one I think dated 2009. So for example, if you were to look at the response during the worldwide global financial crisis that hit after 2009, et cetera, versus to look at the same response, let's say pre-Trump being elected in 2016, then look at the same response again after the January 6th, insurrection, et cetera, whether we would see big differences in terms of some of these results, and also in the age of the people responding.
Ted, that's a fantastic question. If I sort of had a magic wand or funding, either of the two are kind of unlikely. I would want to have either annual or even twice annual measures of anti-Semitism and related measures that could occur regularly, so we can answer exactly your question. What I'm hearing in your question is, during these upheavals, are there these spikes of anti-Semitism? Are there these spikes of anti-Israel sentiments that kind of, become greater as there are social upheavals of the kind you're talking about? It's a great question. And
it's that, but it's also, and I think this has come up even amongst a lot of our Jewish and Israeli friends, so including a lot of Israeli colleagues of mine. So if you looked at the current attitudes and like the boycott, the academic boycott vote that was just taken by AAS, the American Anthropological Association, in context of what's currently going on inside of Israel, within the Israeli government and all the other stuff about the judiciary, et cetera, and you were to take that exact same set of questions and responses back, let's say 12 years ago, 13 years ago, et cetera, I think you would get very different responses, even within the Jewish community now, obviously, these things are rising up too. So I think this is incredible research. I just think it also needs to be hopefully divided up according to the age level of respondents, because that turns out to be, to me, a really important issue about how early do people start, as Mark knows and has talked about, how early, do people start developing these things? Are they developing them more now, as teenagers, even before they get into college, et cetera?
There's this book I've been reading by David Bernstein called Woke Anti-Semitism, describing kind of the culture on college campuses around the necessary legitimate concerns that sort of liberal progressives have about equality and social justice, but how that has become insinuated with anti-Israel feelings. And so that, I think this addresses your question, where there could be a generational variant on the ways in which anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiments are expressed. Is that what I'm hearing you saying?
Yes, and those of us who went to college back 50 plus years ago, if you looked at the shift between Democrats and Republicans in terms of pro-Israel stuff, et cetera, now it's almost like we're on a different planet. So
I know that. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry,
By the way,
dominate it all. Thank you. There were just it raised a lot of wonderful things. Go ahead, Mark and others.
Mark.
Hey, Ken, so nice to meet you. And on a personal note, my brother Matt graduated from Rutgers Newark, and I spent a year as a pre-doctoral internship at what was once known as UMDMJ. Good to see you.
Nice to meet you.
I loved your presentation. I felt I learned so much today. And I have two brief reactions. One is to your question about the interesting finding about Republicans. And if I am recalling correctly, your finding, it was that on the one hand, Republicans were more likely to be anti-Semitic, but also more likely to be pro-Israel, right? And one hypothesis I have about that is Republicans were very much in favor of wars in the Middle East to protect democracy or to even promote and come in and insert democracy. So I wonder how much of that is your findings are explained by this belief that Israel is a beacon of democracy in the region and has to be protected, even though the people who believe that may also have been raised with biases about Jews. So that's one hypothesis I have. Another reaction is to use slightly different language from your findings. I think some of your findings point again to just how convenient it is to make Jews scapegoats for things. And an anecdote I can share, it's kind of an illustration of what you were saying earlier. I'm reading this book right now about this horrible prisoner of war camp in Richmond during the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And the population in Richmond was starving, as were the prisoners. And the people in the city blamed Jews.
Whoa. Is this Andersonville?
They blamed Jews because Jews had controlled some businesses in the city, but they had nothing to do with food distribution for the most part. But they were blamed by the general population for the starvation, which had nothing to do with Jews. It had to do with the fact that the North was was effectively destroying their railroad lines and blockading them and conquering a lot of the areas where they grew food. So it just underscores for me how Jews, we know about so many other instances in history where Jews are the scapegoats. And I think that your findings, some of your particular findings, with these crazy conspiracy theories are yet just another example of conveniently scapegoating Jews. So thank you. I very much enjoy this, and I look forward to reading more of your work and hopefully having the pleasure of meeting you in person someday.
Well, Mark, first, thanks for all that. And it was really, and by the way, was that Andersonville?
No, it was the Libby prison, which, and then many of those men, by the way, were transferred to the notorious Andersonville. But what happened in Libby prison was, it was like a concentration camp, except they were not tortured, but
yeah.
Thousands and thousands of men just starved to death or died of disease from horrible conditions. And by the way, the prisoners were also blamed. The two scapegoats by the general population were the prisoners and the Jews.
Wow.
The Jews were not in the prisons, and the Northerners who were in the prison were starving because of them, when in fact everybody was starving.
Okay, so but I appreciate those great comments. Both, just so people know, these comments are really valuable for me. So I'm taking notes as you're talking, because they really help as I go forward. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Leslie O'Connell.
Yes, thanks so much. This has just been a wonderful presentation. Following up from the comments about, or the studies about trying to manage fear of death, and I know there weren't enough subjects to break them down by the religion of the subject. I understand in Christianity, Jews are seen as having killed Jesus, their God, or a threat to their God. I don't know in Islam, I don't know much about Islam, or to know in what way we're a direct threat when it comes to their beliefs about salvation or the afterlife. So I was going to ask about that, and also that the manifestation of how the aggression of Jews is considered, and I don't know if this is just more specific to the existence of Israel in a Muslim area of the world, but it seems to be that the threat is that the Jews are taking over the physical locations of things, such as the Temple Mount area, that it seems more like a geographical takeover as opposed to they're killing our God. I don't know if that has to do more specifically with the existence of Israel where it is, or if it has to do with the beliefs about death and the afterlife in Islam versus Christianity.
Yeah, so Leslie, these are really rich questions, and to be, I mean, I gotta be honest, to a certain degree, they sort of exceed my knowledge, because a lot of what you're talking about is almost like geopsychology. And I wish I, what I do know, I really know not as much as I should about both Christian and Muslim theology. The little I do know about, in Islam is that there are, certain passages in the Quran that are fairly hostile to Jews, and that they both, there's some who've written on this topic say that one of the reasons that there might be particular hostility towards Jews amongst Christians and Muslims compared to, let's say, like, Hindus or Buddhists, is that Jews share, in fact, provide the foundation for all three Abrahamic faiths, but they decline to join in what both Christians and Muslims regard as their improvements on the initial texts, and their refusal to join could represent a lack of a better word, an insult, where that doesn't occur for someone who's Hindu or Buddhist or some other faith, who are just in a sense orthogonal. So there is that complexity. To the degree in which, the hostility in the Middle East towards Israel is based on geography as opposed to theology.
Oh, no, no, just to clarify, I didn't mean geography as opposed to theology, but not, and again, I don't know enough about Islam and their thoughts about the afterlife, but
Yeah.
there's something very specific about in Christianity, the idea that we've actually killed
Yes.
God. And I don't know if there's anything comparable to that in Islam. So, and I realize it's hard to get enough subjects to separate them out by their own religious belief, but
Yeah.
this idea of trying to protect against our own fears of death and it making us cling to our culture more, if that's just more generic versus the specificity that you find in Christianity.
Yes.
Where that's, and it may be that the clinging to our own culture, regardless of the culture's religious beliefs about the afterlife, may be the larger portion of explaining it. And in addition to that, there may be something a little bit more specific about something with Christianity, that the Jews killed Jesus in old-fashioned, pre-Vatican II belief. So I'm just thinking that if it may be the dominant thing is we want to cling to our culture in times of fear, and then there may be this additional piece depending on the religion.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I can easily, clearly, unambiguously say I don't know, but it's a very important question, and so it's worth looking into. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes left. Ina, I see your hand is raised. Ina?
Yes, so a couple of minutes. I have like comments and questions, and this was so rich. Thank you so much, Dr. Harber. It's, you brought up so many points that we need another like 5 hours to talk about. But I just wanted to mention that, I come from former Soviet Union. My grandparents suffered from pogroms that were anti-Zionist pogroms. So Jews were equal to Zionists. So this kind of agenda that I am anti-Zionist, not anti-Jewish or anti-Semite, it's kind of a bogus one for me. My grandma also was sent to gulags for being Zionist sympathizer because she kept a notebook of her brother who was quartered by horses during those anti-Zionist pogroms during Stalin. So it's, again, she was a Zionist or pro-Zionist just because she was a Jew. So it was no Israel at that time existed. And Israel started to exist only after, the Holocaust and 1948. So Israel cannot be blamed for all the anti-Semitism. So this is also bogus to me. So there are other things like, and also one thing I did want to mention that it's not only very right, it's very left also is anti-Israel. And for me, it's anti-Semitic. And the latest discussion on Division 39 of the APA, where Lara Sheehy conversation and around her, and who is I was called the bigot just because I was saying that, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I was called the bigot.
Really?
And attacked, yes.
You're called a bigot for making that statement?
Yes. Because that was offensive to Arab colleagues. So that's how it was framed. So I see that Dr. Kavler Adler is here. She was on the same listserv, so she can attest to that. And, and a lot of young psychologists reached out to me privately on DM saying, thank you for supporting, Israel. I cannot speak out because I can risk my tenure. I can risk my job. So it's not just the right agenda, it's a left. So I don't think we should divide that, because that will split us even more. I think it's just anti-Semitic agenda, which is anti-Zionist agenda. So that's all I.
I just want to be clear that in that slide that I showed, it wasn't that there is no anti-left, that the problem exists only with the Republicans are only with left. The problems exist for both, with slightly different profiles. So so there, and as an academic, I have had my own experiences within academia of hostility towards Israel. So I know what that looks like. But it just appears, that the complexion of hostility towards Jews and hostility towards Israel might differ by political party. So, but I'm glad you raised those points.
Thank you so much. It was so rich. We need another discussion with you, like for a longer time.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kent, if you're willing to do a part 2, I would welcome it. Something you could think about. We could talk. I'm not going to put you on the spot to answer that right now, but it was a fabulous talk. Very, very interesting research and really rich questions and really rich discussion. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to upload this talk on our YouTube channel. And please stay tuned for the next Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism webinar. Thanks again, Dr. Harber. Very much appreciated.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great presentation. Thanks, Kent, and thanks, Julie. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, Mark. Bye-bye.